This is chapter 23, the transport systems. So you're going to see there's a lot to cover on these, but mainly it's about the cardiovascular system. So most animals have to have some sort of a circulatory system to get their oxygen nutrients to them. And the ones we're going to spend our bulk of our time with are going to be the closed systems. But that doesn't mean that that's the only one. We're also going to take a minute here at the beginning to talk about the open ones as well. So that's going to be stuff like bugs and things like that. So you'll see a little bit about those. Now, some organisms are small enough that diffusion does the work for them, but others need to have other methods to do this. So one organism that is pretty easy to do diffusion is going to be our hydra. That only has a couple layers of cells, and because of that, it's able to move quite a bit of its nutrients and wastes in and out just by passing its gastrovascular cavity. Okay, planaria are also like this. They're pretty thin organisms, so diffusion ends up being a pretty easy way for them to get through. So you'll see that in the next slide. So this one right here on the left, that's the hydra. Okay, the hydra is kind of like a jellyfish, but it's basically got a big old cavity in the middle, and then a very thin layer of cells, and it allows for exchange in and out pretty easily. Whereas the planaria are these flatworms, these guys, their cells are pretty close to that center area, so they're able to move things in and out pretty quickly without much issue or difficulty. Now, some of the organisms that have an open circulatory system, so those first ones, all they did was diffusion. They move stuff through the cells pretty quickly. Open circulatory systems are those which they have some beginnings of a vessel, a heart that will pump stuff, but they also have these tubes that just pump out the lymph or the hemolymph, okay, that's this right here, into an open kind of space in their body where all the organs are. That's called the hemocoel. So once that's used up and it actually sends off the oxygen or the nutrients it needs, it's then sucked back into the openings in the wall of the heart, and then it's ejected back, and it just keeps on going this way. So it still circulates, but it doesn't stay contained in vessels. There's a time where it just kind of pours out. You know, think about like a water hose out on the lawn, right? If you just leave it on, it just pours out everywhere. That's kind of what these look like. You start off with a tube or a vessel, and it just pulls that stuff out. And then you've got these trachea tubes that end up pushing through and bringing in oxygen and taking away carbon dioxide. So they don't even need to have lungs. So here's what that looks like in diagram. You've got the ostium, those little openings, okay, and that pumps things through the heart. And so once that hemolymph pumps into the heart, it goes through those arteries down the sides, and then it opens up into the hemocoel. And then once it gets pumped back in, the oxygen ends up refilling it, and that's able to pass through. And that's an open circulatory system. It ends up basically pouring out into that hemocoel, but then it ends up coming back and getting oxygenized in there. So it's pretty simple, but very different from us. Now, closed circulatory system is what we have. That system is a system that basically moves the blood through vessels. Okay, that's the big deal. So now instead of it opening up and pouring into some cavity, you now have vessels that are going to go through it. There's three types. There's arteries, veins, and capillaries. So it's pretty easy to remember which are which, and we're going to talk about a lot of them. But the arteries are the ones that end up carrying the oxygen-rich blood to the rest of the body from the lungs. The veins carry that oxygen-poor blood back to the heart and then the lungs. And the capillaries are the parts that mix into every little appendage, organ, and that's how the blood gets to the rest of the body. And of course, the lymphatic system is there to help pick up that excess tissue and return it back to the blood. So here's kind of a very basic idea of what that looks like. So if you remember the other picture with the grasshopper, the heart was up at the top just like this was, but the difference is instead of there being capillaries down there, it was a hemocoel. So here, that oxygenated blood, which has now gone to the heart is the big muscle that pushes it to the rest of the body. And once it goes there, it mixes. And so down here where these capillaries are, that's going to be where there's an organ or your fingertips or your toes or your calf. And that covers everything in the body. And then from there, once it's been deoxygenated somewhat, it goes up the veins, back to the heart, to be pumped over to the lungs. So that's our version, but there are others that are less complicated. So let me show you what those look like. So if you look at it here, this is a simpler version. Okay, this would be like in a fish. A fish has an atrium and a ventricle. Okay, it's got two parts to their little heart. And they've got the aorta on the other side. So for them, their blood pumps, after it's been used up, it goes over here to the gill capillaries. Basically, the gill is their lung. And in there, you see how it goes from blue to red? That means that it goes from low oxygen to higher oxygen. Then the aorta pumps it to the rest of the body. And from there, it goes to what are called the systemic capillaries. Those are the things that basically, lead to the fins, the swim bladder, the different organs that a fish has. Once it's done, it goes back to the atrium and the ventricle, and that single atrium and ventricle pump it back to the gills, and it gets back to being oxygenated. So it's a pretty good system, even though it's simple, but it's a one-circuit system, so no complex loops there. Now, once you get over here, these amphibians and reptiles tend to have a little bit more of a complex system. They've got two loops here. So if we follow right here on the left side, the blood will go up into the right atrium. Okay, remember it's right side because we're looking at it like if it were facing us. So from there, it ends up mixing in with some of that oxygen-rich blood, and some of it will go up to the pulmonary capillaries to become more oxygenated. So that's our next step right up here. Think of that as our 2, that was our 1 over here. Okay. Then, after it's gotten oxygenated, it has to go back to the heart, but because it doesn't have a little divider in here, it ends up getting mixed with some of this blood from step 1. And then from there, it ends up going to the rest of the body in step 3. Okay, so from here, it goes from the pulmonary circuit, finally out of there, to the rest of the body. And notice, because of this system, a lot of the time it ends up being mixed blood, so it ends up not being as efficient as some of these other systems. So there's a lot of mixing in here, and that's because the heart itself is not well divided. This ends up just kind of mixing into this section right there. Now, for us, birds and crocodiles, we have it totally divided. So you can see here, see how there's a little division right there? We're going to look at the pieces of the heart in a minute. But basic idea is, here's your step 1, right? Get to the heart. From the heart, you go to the pulmonary part of the lungs, or to the body, where in here, you get oxygenated. So it goes from blue to red. Then, once it goes to red, now it has oxygen, it goes back to the heart, step 3. Okay, but once it's in the heart, it does not mix back with the blood from step 1. It stays there, and it basically just uses the heart as a pumping point and goes down here to step 4, which is the rest of the body. After it's been used up in whatever part of the body it needs, it goes back up to step 1 again. So you see how this keeps it nice and organized, keeps it separated. There's no real need for it to have any mixing of the blood. So there's not much pink except for the capillaries, where it's actually becoming used, and then from there, once it's used, it goes to the rest of the heart to continue on again. So for humans, this tends to be a little bit more interesting because we have to have that double pump. So here's a little bit more detail of what it looks like. Now, again, when we're looking at the sides here, we're looking at it in terms of your which side has the oxygen poor and oxygen rich, okay, and that's in the heart. But you have to remember both sides of the body have the oxygen poor and oxygen rich blood. So just because we see the heart and it looks like it's just got one side and the other, it ends up being both sides. So you'll see that. The big terms here are atrias and ventricles. Okay, atria tend to be those upper portions of the heart that are very thin, and the ventricles are the lower portions that have very thick muscles. So you'll see that in just a bit. Excuse me. And then so in the valves over here, the way it works is your blood moves in one direction. So the AV valves, those are the atrioventricular, they're the ones that separate the atria and the ventricle. So there's never any mixing of blood, but you can have backflow of blood. That's what you call a heart murmur. Okay, you've got that leaky AV valve, that atrioventricular. Okay, and then those semilunar valves are the ones that go from the ventricles to the vessels, the rest of the body. Okay, and again, the big key terms here are arteries okay, take blood away, whereas veins take blood to the heart. And then the heart takes it and sends it off to the other parts it needs to go to. And so in the pulmonary circuit, the way that works is the vena cava, this is this big vein on the bottom of the heart. It takes this O2 poor blood and it goes to the right atrium. Okay, if you remember the atrium, that's on top. From the atrium, it goes into the atrioventricular valve. That's a little flap right there. We call it the tricuspid valve. Okay, and it goes to the right ventricle. So now the blood that was O2 poor is on the bottom portion of the heart. Okay, from there, it then flows to the semilunar valve to get into the pulmonary trunk. Okay, pulmonary trunk, and then from there, it goes to the pulmonary arteries, which means at that point, it is now being pumped to the lungs. That's what pulmonary means. So this is the way to get the O2 poor blood to the lungs. Once you get it to the lungs, it's going to get oxygen because you're breathing. The O2 blood then goes to the left atrium. So now we're on the left side, top portion of the heart. It goes again to the other atrioventricular valve, what we call the bicuspid valve, okay, into the left ventricle. The left ventricle is that thick muscle. From there, it's going to pump it through the other semilunar valve, and it's going to go into the aorta, leading out to the tissues. So basically, once you take it to the lungs, it ends up getting pumped full of oxygen, but it needs to go back to the heart to be able to make it to the rest of the body. So you'll see that in the next diagram in just a bit. So here's where we go. So if you follow along down here, so this is step 1. So this is our O2 poor blood coming in from the bottom or even from the top. Okay, so we can put a step 1 up here as well. Now it goes into here and it goes into the right atrium. That's step 2. So now it's getting into the thinner portion of the heart, and there's our tricuspid valve. Okay, right here. This opens up, pours the O2 poor blood in here into step 3, which is the right ventricle. That blood then pumps up through into that first semilunar valve. And then right here, you see how it goes to both sides? This pulmonary artery and that group of pulmonary arteries. Those two are going to the right and the left lung. Okay. Now, once it goes to the lungs, it comes back, if you look at it right here, either through this side or from the back of the heart. Okay, you got to think 3D. Over here, and this would be what we would dub step 4. Now, we're in the left atrium. Okay. Once we're in the left atrium, we then go through the bicuspid valve. That's this one right here. Okay. And again, this is where you get the heart murmurs in the valves, bicuspids and the tricuspid valves. So if there's a little bit of a backflow, okay, there's never any mixing, but a backflow can lead to that heart murmur. So now you go in here to the ventricle, okay, and now the whole point of this, you got to think 3D, you got to go behind your part of the ventricle right here, where the semilunar valve is, up to the other semilunar valve. So you're here now, and then right here you see these 3 little aortic arteries, and that one down there. That is going to send it to the bottom part of your body, so that's going to go to your legs. Okay, that would be step 6, where it's going to the legs, or up here to the brain to keep your upper body and your brain well oxygenated. And then once it's all done, where's it going to come back through? Step 1 over here, or step 1 over there, and the whole process goes again. So the way the heart works is you've got a diastole and a systole, right? The systole is a contraction, a diastole is a relaxation. When you use a stethoscope to hear the beat of a heart, you're going to hear a sound like lub-dub, lub-dub, lub-dub. That sound is basically your valves opening and closing. That's letting the blood flow through. If you hear an extra little beat in there, lub-dub-dub, lub-dub-dub, that ends up being a heart murmur, because some of that blood is flowing back and the valve is opening up. Think of like those old Western movies when the good guy comes in through the swinging doors. Well, in real life, those doors will swing and then they'll end up opening back up. That's kind of what a heart murmur is. Okay, so you can measure the pulse by looking at the beat of this heart, because every 0.85 seconds, that atria contracts and then it ends up relaxing. And so we can count that. So basically 1 second is going to give you that beat of the heart. And so if you measure it for 6 seconds, multiply that times 10, that tells you how many beats per minute you have. And again, this is all controlled by your nervous system and your hormones. So you can't stop your heartbeat, but you can slow it down or speed it up. So if you look at it right here, here's kind of the 3 big steps here. If you take a look at the heart, the upper portions of the heart right here, okay, the atria, they're wider. In those portions, the atria are enlarged because they're currently in systole. They're right now relaxed. I'm sorry, they're now currently contracted. That's why they look kind of thinner, right? But then, if you go down to phase 2 over here, if you look at that same section, that's now wider and that's now thinner because the bottom is in contraction, okay? So that's now in systole. And then over here, they both kind of widen and relax. That's because they're both now in relaxation mode. So that's the beat of the heart. The starts up here, moves down to the bottom. So if you look at it on here, you'll see phase 1 again. The atrial is in systole, meaning that it's currently going to be slightly contracted, okay? But then over here, the ventricle is in systole. So that, you see how it got really pointy? That's because that's contracting down there in phase 2. Then in phase 3, they both relax. And at that point, that's when they end up neither one being contracted. So that's where you get that lub-dub sound. The lub is going to be those valves opening, okay, right here and over here, okay? And that's what you're hearing when you hear the heartbeat. Okay, and that's again seeing what time it happens. That all occurs within 0.85 seconds for your entire life. And so here's kind of where the 2 muscle contractions begin. You've got the SA node right up here, and that ends up leading a contraction to the atrial portions. And then you've got another little muscle contraction happening right there at the AV node, and that's what causes these to contract. When you see this in an ECG or an electrocardiogram, basically you see that kind of jump up, that drop, and that kind of return to normal just so it can do it again, okay? And so that ends up being that electrical change in the heart as it happens. Once in a while, you can end up with an abnormality, and that's ventricular fibrillation right there. Basically, the contraction is not very coordinated, so the electrical charge doesn't pass through the way it happens. So this can be stopped with a defibrillator. It doesn't end up, defibrillator is not like the movies. You don't die and then it restarts your heart. What it does is it sends the electrical charge through the heart to normalize this beat. So it's not like the movies. And in this slide, we're looking at the blood vessels, so you can kind of see what's going on. But the big key is up here at the top. So you can see kind of the order of where things go. All right, if you start at the heart, the blood will move through the arteries and the arterioles and then get to the capillaries. That's the connector right there. That's where the blood mixes. So over here, this is where the O2 is rich, okay? So we're going to say O2 is up, okay, and that's a little arrow. And then over here, we're going to see the O2 is down. So that's a really big O, sorry. And that's because it's then gone to the capillaries and sent off whatever it needs. But it needs to get back to the heart. That's the key thing. And once it's at the heart, then it goes back over here and it runs through the whole system. So, you know, this is important to know, but it's all connective tissue, smooth muscle, elastic fibers, and then finally epithelial tissue. And it just gets smaller and smaller. So the heart is very large, so are the arteries. The arterioles get smaller, okay? So in the arteries, basically you can stick a whole finger in there. Arterioles, you can probably stick a little tiny end, but you might start to tear the arteriole. Capillaries are so tiny, they're microscopic. They're in every cell or close to every cell we have. That's why you get blood. So if you scratch yourself on the hand, it's because you've got capillaries that have blood going to every portion of that body, okay? Once it's done, it goes back up the venules and up to the veins where you then get to your heart, okay? So same order happens. It reverses in order, okay? And that's why we have blood. So there's no blood pouring into your organs or your body. It's just a bunch of capillaries that are feeding blood, and their cells are all attached to that. So when we say that we've got blood going to the lungs, you don't have a pool of blood in the lungs. You've got blood in capillaries around the lungs, and those capillaries are close to the alveoli, where you end up with a bit of oxygen filling them back up and sending them off, or transferring that gas off. And so capillaries here, you can see what I was talking about. They're the small, tiny, microscopic tubes, and they're composed of not epithelium, but endothelium. So they end up being the stuff that is going to be lining inside, but they're microscopic, so every cell is less than 1 millimeter away from a capillary. That's why it doesn't matter if you get a scratch on your outside or if you get a bruise inside, there's going to be blood spilled because every cell is close to these things. Now if you look over here, the other outer layers of the veins or the venules, they're the same thing. Connective tissue, smooth muscle, elastic fibers, and epithelium. They're the same thing, they're just moving blood the opposite direction, and they're moving blood that the O2 has been used up on. So for the ways to get blood moving is through blood pressure, right? You can do this through skeletal muscles or with thoracic pressure in the thoracic cavity pressure. So when you inhale, that ends up pushing a lot of that blood out of the capillaries and moving them away, and that ends up preventing quite a bit of backflow. So you're able to move blood through your breathing, and that's why they recommend if your blood pressure is too high, you can take deep breaths. That'll slow things down. Okay. And so right here you see the blood, when the muscles contract, that ends up kind of pinching it off, and the blood that's the northern portion of here, right, to the heart will go faster, and the blood on the bottom will end up getting kind of stopped up. That's why they give you a tourniquet when they're trying to take your blood for some sort of a measurement of some kind. They do that because they're basically pinching it off and letting it pool and collect so they can gather some. Once they've inserted the needle and they can see the blood's there, then they will release the tourniquet and that'll let the blood flow into the tube that they need. And so I mentioned earlier some circuits, right? You've got pulmonary circuits and systemic circuits, okay, and portal systems. So the pulmonary circuit is pretty simple. It's basically just the idea of the O2 poor blood flowing to the lungs, getting its oxygen as needed, giving off CO2, and then finally going back to the heart so that it can be pumped to the rest of the body. The systemic circuit is that idea of taking that O2 rich blood and taking it to the rest of the body. Once it does that, it's giving off the CO2 it's collected, and it's picking up the CO2 in the rest of the body that's been produced by the cells. And then of course it ends up going back through that vena cava. Okay, and the portal system basically is a little portion of the capillary system that takes blood from that capillary bed to the intestines and to the rest of the body. And then once it's done, it goes back to the vena cava, so that there will be quite a bit of mixing and allowing for the intestinal system to go from there. And so here's kind of that simple pathway of the blood. And you see there's two different, this shows the left and the right side, but what I want you to understand is both sides have both of these systems. So you have a carotid artery and a jugular vein on both sides. So those arteries are taking the O2 poor blood, O2 rich blood up to the brain, okay, from that lungs. And so as you can see, the heart is the central system here. The heart takes that O2 poor blood and pumps it to the lungs. Once it's in the lungs, it then goes back to the heart and goes to the rest of the body. After it's been used up, right, in the capillaries in different locations, it ends up going back up to the heart as O2 poor blood, and then getting back to the lungs to do the whole thing again. It comes down here this way as well. So it ends up being a good way to do this. And here's our capillary system. We'll get a good look at that in just a second. And the other little attachment here is the lymphatic system. The lymphatic system is there to kind of help pick up leftover tissues. So here's that closer look. There's the O2 rich blood, the red stuff, and then it mixes into this purplish look. And then right here, there's the O2 poor blood, and now it's ready to go back in the other direction, back to the heart. Okay. And then there's the lymphatic system. Okay, so the lymphatic system is basically just going to be the ability to take up that excess tissue, return it back to the blood. It can also take up fat when you're down to the digestive tract. And so it ends up being a little bit portion of the immune system as well. That ends up, once you end up with swelling in those lymph nodes, that's one way you know your immune system is kind of overreacting a bit. And there's all the vessels you can see. They're very similar to the vessels of the blood system, except they're not moving blood, they're moving fluid instead. And so there you see it again, a little bit closer, but it's dependent on squeezing, so you're still dealing with blood pressure, except it's not blood. In this case, it's lymphatic fluid, or lymph, okay? And so it goes into larger and larger vessels, and it ends up doing kind of a dump up at the subclavian veins. That's where the transfer happens between the blood and the lymphatic system quite a bit. And so as you can see right here, these are the lymphatic capillaries. These are the ones that mix in with the blood capillaries. So at these points, you do have some exchange of tissue, of fluid. So it's not just a one-way system. We'd like to think it was just the one thing, right? Just the blood or just the lymphatic system. But they end up mixing and helping each other out and allowing for that exchange to happen. And so during that exchange, you end up with tissue and blood getting passed through, and it's all about blood pressure. So there's a force that kind of pushes things in and out. Usually at the arterial end, it goes out. The oxygen and the nutrients get into the fluid, and then from there, it's reduced at the venous end, right? So it's just a way of pumping it through. And that's all caused by osmotic pressure, by salt and protein. So we mentioned earlier, you can change your blood pressure with your skeletal movements. But you can also change your blood pressure with the amount of salt and protein, because that changes the osmotic pressure. Okay, and that's going to, of course, affect the capillaries of the lymph as well. And so as you can see it here, the blood is flowing through the arterial end at the top, and it's picking up certain things. There's got salt and plasma in there. And so at certain points at the beginning, it's releasing some of that water and that oxygen. And as it releases more of the oxygen, the water, some of the glucose and amino acids, that's where it starts to take in the waste and the carbon dioxide, as well as, again, still losing water all the way through. That's why it has to go back to the heart and through the kidneys eventually, so that it can replenish some of those things and keep the balance of all those. So that's why you can see that the big organ systems that are contributing to this are those respiratory ones for the gases. You have the digestive ones for the glucose and the proteins. And then you've also got the urinary ones to make sure you've got that water balance as well. And again, it's not exact, so we can't look at it perfectly. And of course, you've got that lymphatic system collecting quite a bit of that excess tissue. So it all ends up getting returned back to that main system through the cardiovascular capillaries. And so what is blood? The whole point of blood is to do four things, right? Transport substances to get it where it's got to go. It's got to help defend the body because it's got all those white blood cells and other portions. And it also regulates body temperature. You know, blood flows back and forth to keep things working. And then, of course, you've got clots to make sure that if there's a wound or an injury, you don't end up having a life-threatening loss of blood. So for humans, we got two main things, plasma, and then we've got the formed elements. That's the red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, the rest of it. Okay, so here's what it looks like. At the top, that's that clear stuff, the plasma. So when that ends up looking kind of yellowish and dark, if they take a blood sample, that means it's got more fat in the blood. That's not a good thing. Okay, and then that's about 55%. Less than 1% are the formed elements of the leukocytes. That's the white blood cells here and the platelets. The rest of it is 45%. That's whole blood. That's the red blood cells. That's what the erythrocytes are called. And so plasma, again, mainly water, but it's got proteins. It tends to be really nutrient rich. That's why it's so important whenever you donate blood. They may ask you to donate plasma. That's because those small nutrients, the salts, those are important for people who are trying to recover from certain immunosuppressant systems or issues. So that's why they may ask you, if you're a larger person or a taller person, to donate plasma. And then you've got the formed elements, right? That's going to be the red blood cells. They transport the oxygen. They have hemoglobin, but they don't have an actual nucleus. So that's a big deal there for them, okay? And then you've got issues where you have anemia, where you have the lack of red blood cells, so no hemoglobin, no iron, right? That's the big deal. And blood lasts for about 3 months. After that, it ends up getting recycled in the liver and going through the body that way. So here's what it looks like in a micrograph, so under the microscope. And so these are the formed elements. So we've got red blood cells. These make up about 4 to 6 million per millimeter cubed in your body. And their main function is gas, O2 and CO2. So if you got those two transporting, that's what they're there for. And you've got the white blood cells. These are the bigger ones. They lack the number. They actually do have a nucleus, so that is there. So they don't have nearly as much numbers, but there are many different types. You've got neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils, lymphocytes, monocytes. So these are the ones that are more famous, right? The B and the T cells. Those are pretty common, but they all have different roles, and they're all in the white blood tissue. So here's kind of the table that shows what they are. So the neutrophils, these are the ones that phagocytize, right? So these are only going to be about 5 to 11,000 per millimeter cubed in the blood, so not very much. Okay. The eosinophils, these are the ones that are the granules. They digest big pathogens, worms, and for inflammation, right? Then you got basophils. These also promote blood flow. They go to inflamed tissue if there's a bump or a bruise and there's swelling of some sort. The basophils get made to do those. Then you got the lymphocytes. Those are the ones that do the heavy lifting. They produce the antibodies. If you've got some sort of a disease, they build up kind of like a template to say, hey, we know how to fight this. So if you get that disease again, your body should be able to fight it off. And then the monocytes, they're these macrophages that basically eat up old cells. So the ones that do the biggest jobs and are there the most times, those are the neutrophils. Okay, they're the daily ones. And the lymphocytes, they're the specialized ones, so to speak. And so platelets and thrombocytes, what they do is they're the clotting factors in the blood. So when you end up with a wound, that those platelets gather there to kind of block it off, and then prothrombin and fibrinogen are used to form a matrix to make the initial scab or covering. Then eventually the healing happens. Now, if you have hemophilia, you have a clotting disorder where you can't make the clotting factors, so you end up just kind of bleeding out. That's why it's really dangerous to get a wound or a cut of any kind if you have hemophilia. So that's what these look like. They're very small, but they do end up kind of being a little larger in number, 150 to 300,000. It's all clotting. So here's how it works, right? You've got your opening for some reason, whatever that might be, and the platelets start to build up. They then form a plug across it, and that plug stops the bleeding. Now, that doesn't last forever. You need to have kind of fibers form across it. So that's what the next one is. So the prothrombin and the fibrinogen, they get formed with this extra calcium, and they form these fibrin threads. Okay, so they're basically ends up trapping the blood cells, and it's clotting, and that ends up being your kind of your pre-scab there. So if you look at it, that's what it looks like in a good diagram there. These fibrin threads kind of weave all the way across. They block it up, and they cause kind of a major blockage, and that's good because then that can end up leading a healing factor so that you end up closing that wound and fixing whatever happened in that capillary. Now, unfortunately, there are cardiovascular disorders that tends to be the leading cause of death, of preventable death in the United States and Western countries. That tends to be stuff like hypertension, high blood pressure, and of course, the way we eat. That's a big no-no in the way cardiovascular disorders happen as well. So hypertension is when you end up with people with atherosclerosis. Basically, they've got fatty deposits in their arteries. And when you have hypertension, the vessels constrict, they close up. And if you've got too much of that fat built up in the middle of the artery, it can end up forming a thrombus. And then if it ends up breaking free, it can cause a stroke, where it blocks the arteriole, one of those smaller tubes to the brain, and that ends up shutting off part of the brain and causing a stroke. And so that's what the plaque looks like, right? So your normal tube is supposed to be this open space, but unfortunately, it's now getting blocked by the fat buildup. And you can see this in a real slide, right? That's that white spot right there, that's all fat. And so the heart attack, what happens is, if it's not getting enough oxygenated blood, the heart will then have its muscle die. And that's when you've got issues. So the way to do this is you can end up with a coronary artery completely blocked, and that can end up causing a death of the tissue. So you got to get two possible things to get this out of the way. That's where you have a coronary bypass or a balloon angioplasty. Okay, so that's what these two look like. Coronary bypass is where the arteries are blocked, so what they do is they end up taking grafted vessels from the rest of the body, usually from the legs or from the arms, and they'll put them to kind of reroute the blood to go back. So this portion of the heart can be blocked, and so because of that, you end up with kind of these extra pathways to get the blood around, and that's called a coronary bypass. You can have a single, double, triple, quadruple, or even a quintuple bypass. That means they have to make more of those vessels to get the blood around. So if that happens, that's not a good thing, and it can't really be reversed. You can't fix that. Once it happens, you're done. So it's important to maintain your health before this stuff happens. The other way is if the artery is blocked, you can have a stent. Okay, the stent is put in there, and it's put in through a balloon angioplasty. Basically, the balloon opens up that wiry stent, and it lets the artery open back up, even though the fat's still there, but the stent remains to kind of hold the pressure open. So that's one way without having to do the coronary bypass.